All right, ready to dive deep. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, the self.
Ah, yes, the self.
We're going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on feminist perspectives on the self.
Sounds dense, right? But I promise you it's surprisingly engaging. What's so fascinating about this is that feminist philosophers don't just analyze the self in this abstract, theoretical way. They connect it to real-world stuff like power dynamics, social structures, even personal experiences.
So taking philosophy out of the ivory tower and grounding it, right?
Exactly.
So how do we even approach something as big as the self?
Well, I think a good place to start is by understanding how feminist philosophers critique those classic dominant approaches to the self that, we see a lot in Western philosophy. The ones that focus on the independent, rational individual.
Right, right, like the Kantian ethical subject, the one who uses pure reason to find, universal truths.
Yes. Or the utilitarian homo economicus, the one who's always calculating, trying to maximize their self-interest.
Classic examples.
Right, and feminist philosophers come in and argue that these conceptions of the self, even though they're presented as universal, they're actually based on a very specific and limited prototype.
Oh, interesting.
Like they reflect the experiences and perspectives of a particular subset of men, often overlooking the experiences of women and, other marginalized groups.
It's like those supposedly objective and universal ideals are actually, well, pretty biased, reflecting a particular worldview.
Exactly, that's the point. And that bias has real consequences.
Like what?
Take the legal doctrine of coverture, for example.
Okay, coverture.
It was prevalent in many Western societies for centuries, and it literally absorbed a woman's legal identity into her husband's.
Wow.
She couldn't own property, couldn't enter into contracts, couldn't even control her own earnings.
That's a stark example of how a very limited view of the self can actually translate into real-world oppression.
Absolutely. And it's not just about legal rights, these limited views of the self also neglect the huge influence of social structures, relationships, even our own bodies.
Yeah.
All of these things shape who we are and how we experience the world.
Right.
And these views just ignore the complexities of identity, the ones shaped by things like gender, race, class, and so on.
It's almost like they're trying to create a one-size-fits-all model of the self, which obviously doesn't work when you think about the incredible diversity of human experience.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the most exciting things about feminist philosophy. It challenges these narrow conceptions and offers alternative ways of thinking about the self.
Okay, so if the traditional individualistic view of the self is flawed, what do these alternative feminist perspectives offer?
Well, instead of focusing solely on the isolated individual, they kind of shift the lens to the web of relationships, dependencies, social contexts, all the things that actually make us who we are.
So less me and more we.
In a way, yes. Feminist philosophers highlight these aspects of the self that are traditionally undervalued, like interdependence, vulnerability, caregiving. They argue that these qualities, often associated with femininity, are just as important as reason and autonomy when it comes to understanding the self.
Now I see how this challenges those deep-seated biases we were talking about.
Exactly. And it has implications for how we think about everything, from ethics to social justice.
Give me an example.
Well, take care ethics, for example.
Okay.
It emerged from feminist philosophy, and it emphasizes the importance of relationships and responsibilities in moral decision-making. It challenges that traditional emphasis on abstract principles and individual rights.
So instead of asking what's the universally right thing to do, it's asking what's the most caring and responsible action in this specific situation, given the relationships involved.
Precisely. And that shift can have a huge impact on how we approach ethical dilemmas, especially those involving caregiving, family relationships, social inequalities.
Right. It's like we're expanding the definition of what it means to be a moral person, recognizing the importance of empathy, compassion, and responsibility towards others.
Yes, exactly. And another key aspect of this feminist rethinking of the self is the concept of eros.
Okay, eros. Now, isn't that usually associated with romantic love, desire? What does that have to do with the self?
Well, here, eros is understood more broadly as a life force, a drive for connection and creativity.
Okay.
And feminist philosophers like Lucy Irigaray, for example, argue that eros has been traditionally undervalued, even demonized, especially in Western philosophy, which tends to privilege reason and control.
So eros is kind of like this wild, untamed energy that disrupts those neat and tidy categories of the rational self.
Exactly. And Irigaray specifically uses the female body, female sexuality as these symbols to challenge those dominant models of autonomy and self-sufficiency.
Interesting.
She argues for a more fluid and embodied understanding of the self, one that embraces difference, multiplicity, and connection.
This is definitely sounding very different from the independent, rational individual that we started with. It's like we're shifting to a much more complex, interconnected view of the self.
That's a great way to put it. And this shift has implications not just for, how we understand ourselves as individuals, but also for how we think about relationships, society, even the natural world.
It's like pulling on one thread of the self, and this whole tapestry of interconnected ideas and experiences just unravels.
Exactly. And as we, delve deeper into these feminist perspectives, you'll see just how radical and transformative they can be.
Okay, so we've been talking about how feminist philosophers, critique those traditional individualistic views of the self.
Right.
And we've started to explore some of those alternative models that they propose.
Yeah.
The ones that emphasize things like interdependence, care, eros. But I'm curious to see how those ideas actually play out in more concrete, lived experiences.
That's a great point. Feminist philosophy isn't just this abstract theorizing. It's very much engaged with the real world. And one area where we can really see this is in the feminist analysis of pregnancy.
Pregnancy. Okay. That definitely seems like an experience that would challenge our assumptions about, the self.
Absolutely. It involves this profound transformation of the body, a blurring of those boundaries between self and other, all these emotional, psychological changes. It's a great lens to look at the complexities of selfhood.
So how do feminist philosophers approach pregnancy? What unique insights do they offer?
Well, they challenge that traditional notion of a unified, bounded self. Iris Marion Young, for example.
Hmm.
She is a prominent feminist phenomenologist, and she describes pregnancy as a state of split subjectivity.
Split subjectivity. What does that even mean?
Well, it means that the pregnant person experiences their body as both their own and as a space for another being. That distinction between self and other starts to break down.
I can see how that would be both exhilarating and kind of disorienting at the same time.
Exactly. And this challenge to that traditional self, it's not just about individual experience.
Right.
Feminist philosophers also point out the social and political dimensions of pregnancy.
Oh, okay. In what way?
Well, think about the medicalization of pregnancy, for instance. The pregnant body often becomes subject to so much scrutiny, so much control, medical procedures, societal expectations, sometimes even legal restrictions.
It's like the woman's autonomy over her own body is being undermined.
Precisely. And this becomes even more pronounced when we consider things like race and class.
Right.
Women of color, and particularly Black women, often face much higher rates of maternal mortality and morbidity, as well as disparities in access to quality health care.
So the experience of pregnancy, which is already challenging on its own, is made even more difficult by these social and political inequalities.
Absolutely. And that's why these feminist perspectives on the self are so important. They help us understand how those individual experiences are shaped by these larger systems of power and oppression.
It's like we're moving beyond this abstract idea of the self and actually seeing how it's embedded in these very real material conditions.
Exactly. And this attention to the materiality of the self, it brings us to another key area of feminist thought, the focus on embodiment.
Okay, embodiment. I've heard the term, but I'm not sure I fully get it. Can you explain?
Sure. Embodiment in this context means that our bodies aren't just physical objects, but they're deeply intertwined with our identities, our experiences, our ways of being in the world.
So it's not just about having a body, but about how that body shapes our sense of self.
Precisely. Feminist philosophers have done amazing work in exploring the ways that our bodies are shaped by, culture, social norms, and power dynamics.
Can you give me an example?
Well, think about Simone de Beauvoir's famous argument. She argued that women are often defined and constrained by their bodies in ways that men just aren't. Her idea of lived embodiment, it highlights how our bodies are given meaning, significance, but within specific social contexts.
So it's not just biology, but it's about how our bodies are perceived, interpreted, and experienced, right? Within a culture that often prioritizes, well, the male gaze and male experiences.
Exactly. And that can have a huge impact on women's sense of self, their agency, their ability to move through the world freely.
Yeah, it's like women's bodies are so often treated as objects. Objects to be controlled, to be judged, even violated.
And that leads us to another critical area where these feminist perspectives on the self have been so important, the analysis of sexual violence.
Obviously, this is a tough topic, but I think it's so important to talk about.
Absolutely. Feminist philosophers have been essential in challenging the ways that sexual violence is often, minimized, excused, or even blamed on the victims.
I've heard some feminist scholars argue that those traditional conceptions of the field, particularly that idea of the rational, autonomous individual, can actually make it harder to understand and address the trauma of sexual violence.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. Those traditional conceptions often fail to account for the ways that trauma can completely shatter our sense of self, our agency, our trust in the world.
It's like the very foundation of our being is shaken when we experience that kind of violation.
Exactly. And feminist philosophers have offered different frameworks for understanding the impact of trauma, drawing on insights from phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and narrative theory.
So instead of seeing trauma through this lens of individual rationality and control, they're recognizing those profound emotional, psychological, even bodily effects of violence.
Exactly. And they're emphasizing how important it is to listen to survivors' stories, to validate their experiences, and to create spaces for healing and recovery.
It's like shifting the focus from the individual's supposed failure to cope with the trauma to the systemic factors that contribute to the violence and to the silencing of survivors.
Exactly. And this shift in perspective has had a profound impact on how we as a society, understand and respond to sexual violence.
This is all incredibly powerful. It really shows how feminist perspectives on the self aren't just about abstract theories, but about addressing these real-world issues of power, inequality, and injustice.
Absolutely. And as we continue to explore these perspectives, you'll see how they challenge us to rethink our assumptions, not just about the self, but about relationships, society, our place in the world.
So we've covered so much in this deep dive. We've seen how feminist philosophers challenge those traditional views of the self, the individualistic ones. And they've offered some really interesting alternatives. But there's one area I'm still kind of curious about, this idea of a biosocial turn in feminist thought. What does that even mean? How does it relate to, how we understand the self?
That's a great question. It brings us to a really fascinating area in feminist philosophy. The biosocial turn basically challenges that old philosophical divide, the one between nature and culture.
Mm.
It recognizes that our biological and our social selves, they're totally intertwined.
So it's not just like minds floating in bodies, right? We're actually embodied beings shaped by both our biology and our social environments.
Exactly. And this has some big implications for how we think about the self, especially when it comes to other living beings.
You mentioned Cynthia Willett earlier. She argues for a kind of interspecies ethics based on this idea of a shared biosociality, right?
Yes, Willett's work is a perfect example of how the biosocial turn can change how we think about ethics. You see, she argues that our ability to empathize, to care, to connect socially, it's not just limited to humans, it actually comes from our shared evolutionary history with other animals.
So instead of seeing ourselves as separate from and superior to the natural world, we need to recognize our interconnectedness with other species.
Exactly. And this recognition can lead to a more ethical, more sustainable way of life, one that respects all living beings, their value, their dignity.
It's like we're expanding that circle of moral concern beyond just humans and acknowledging, I guess, the interconnectedness of all life.
Right. And it has implications not only for, how we treat animals, but also for how we understand ourselves. If we recognize that shared biosociality with other species, it challenges that old idea that rationality and autonomy are the main things that define us as human.
So instead of seeing ourselves as primarily thinking beings, we start to see the influence of our emotions, our instincts, our bodily experiences.
Exactly. And that leads to a more holistic, more integrated understanding of the self, one that acknowledges the interplay of reason, emotion, embodiment, all of it.
It's like we're moving past that old Cartesian mind-body dualism. We're embracing a more nuanced and embodied view of what it means to be human.
Precisely. And that shift changes how we think about everything, ethics, relationships, our place in the world.
It's really interesting how all these different ideas in feminist thought about the self, they all kind of weave together, the critiques of traditional models, the emphasis on things like interdependence and embodiment, and now this recognition that we're connected to other living beings. It's like a whole new way of understanding what it means to be a person in the world.
It really is. And I think the most exciting thing about feminist philosophy is that it's not just about theory. It's about creating a world that's more just and equitable for everybody.
So where do we go from here? What are some key takeaways from this whole deep dive, something our listeners can hold on to?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways is that how we understand the self, it's not like set in stone. It keeps changing as we encounter new ideas, new experiences, new relationships.
So it's this constant process of discovery and transformation.
Absolutely. And another takeaway, the self isn't isolated or self-contained. It's deeply connected to social structures, cultural norms, relationships with others, humans and non-humans.
It's like we're all part of this big web of life,
Mm.
and how we understand ourselves is always shaped by those connections.
Exactly. And lastly, it's important to remember that these feminist perspectives on the self, they're not just about women. They offer insights that are valuable for everyone.
Yeah, like they provide this framework for understanding how complex human experience really is. And it's a framework that's more inclusive, more nuanced, and in the end, just more humane.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
This has been an amazing journey. We've only just scratched the surface of feminist philosophy, but it's given me so much to think about.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, this is just the beginning. I encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, read what feminist philosophers have to say, and engage in those conversations about the self, identity, and our place in the world.
Yes, to all of that. And one final thought for you, dear listener, to ponder as you continue your own explorations. How might these feminist perspectives make you question your own assumptions about the self? Could they inspire you to live differently, to relate to others differently, to help create a more just and compassionate world? Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you on our next deep dive.